Sorry for being a few minutes late. Dear colleagues and friends, welcome to the 94th Global Health History Seminar. The subject of today's seminar is air pollution. The Global Health History Seminar series was established in late 2004 and is hosted jointly by the World Health Organization and WHO Collaborating Center for Global Health Histories at the University of York. Seminars take place almost once every month and are broadcast via the internet. I'm honored to introduce my co-chair, Dr. Human Mormon, sitting there, Research Associate of Center of Global Health Histories and History Department of the University of York. He is our former WHO staff as well. And our two speakers today, Professor Melanie DuPuis from Pace University of the United States and Dr. Carlos Dara from the Department of Public Health, Environmental and Social Determinants of Health of the World Health Organization. Each presentation will last for about 25 minutes, followed by the Q&A session for both speakers. This will be chaired by Dr. Mormon. Please speak into the microphone and give your name since the seminar will be broadcast. The first speaker is Professor Melanie DuPuis. Melanie DuPuis is a political sociologist who studies politics, governance, and social movements around food and environmental issues. She is the author of Nature's Perfect Food, co-author with David and Michael Goodman of Alternative Food Networks, and the editor of Smog and Mirrors, the Politics and Culture of Air Pollution. Her newest book, Dangerous Digestion, looks at the history of American dietary advice as a mirror of political ideas and tensions in each historical era. She is also the co-editor with Matthew Garcia and Don Michel of the forthcoming collection, Food Across Borders. She is professor and chair of environmental studies and science at Pace University. Melanie, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Just could you let me know how I forward this?
Yes.
My topic today is the work on the political history of environmental reform movements. I want to thank the World Health Organization, Dr. Sanjoy Bhattacharya, and the University of York for inviting me here today to talk about a book I published in 2004 called Smoke and Mirrors, The Politics and Culture of Air Pollution. My most recent work, Dangerous Digestion, The Politics of American Dietary Advice, which is actually coming out this week, will come out, and I'd like to use this talk as an opportunity to actually compare these two works, one published a dozen years ago and the other one just published. While these topics may seem very distant, in fact, as I will show, my history of dietary advice can inform current challenges in air pollution control and wider climate change policy. In fact, the last chapter of Dangerous Digestion is about close topics and how the history of dietary reform can inform current policies on sustainable governance. In particular, this history can tell us a great deal about how our current clean air and climate change challenges. In particular, I want to talk today about the challenge of large-scale changes in personal behavior. Now, on the surface, the histories of dietary advice and air pollution control seem to have little in common. The history of the narrative of diet is usually one of decline. This is particularly, I'm talking in particular about the history of diet in the United States. We used to eat better, and now we eat badly. On the other hand, historically, at least in the higher income Western countries like the US and like Europe, the history of conventional air pollution, about smoke and smog, has been one of progress, about the air getting cleaner for everyone. The early industrial cities had a problem. They acted to control the problem, and it got better. Air got cleaner, health problems due to air pollution improved, a story of success. However, environmental decision makers, both in the industrialized and rapidly industrializing world, are now facing local air pollution and climate change issues that involve the kind of complex political decision making that states have until now avoided. that is, motivating large-scale changes in individual behavior. And before I went back into academia, I was a policy analyst in the early 1990s, which is when the Clean Air Act of 1990 was being implemented at the state level, and I was a policy analyst for the state of New York. And what I saw there was, as we know, conventional pollution is smog is a product of both production and consumption. And to oversimplify, the nitrogen oxides mostly from plants, and the VOCs, much of it from cars. Now, while the fight over control of power plants continues with the Congress and the executive currently in the fight over Obama's Clean Power Plan, in general, the United States has been much more successful in controlling emissions from large plants than it has been in controlling behavior such as driving. We have a similar challenge when it comes to climate change. So what can the history of dietary advice tell us about how to meet this challenge? When it comes, first I want to talk about the word we, okay? When it comes to climate change politics, my colleague Andy Revkin reminds me that there is no one we. The we that has to be targeted in any campaign for large-scale change in individual behaviors should not really include the millions of, say, Indian citizens whose carbon footprints are several orders of magnitude smaller than the footprint of the average American citizen. I am also not talking about the large Indonesian landowner burning peat soil to clear land for palm oil production. That behavior will require enforcing already legislated rules from responsible state institutions, perhaps influenced by global environmental governance organizations. I certainly hope so. The one we I want to talk about here is what I would call the Western lifestyle we. We, according to CNN, the Western lifestylers, a group not necessarily limited to the richer countries, are responsible for at least 80% of total carbon, 20 tons on average per person per year. The Western lifestyle is a long-distance commuter by car or plane, or the person addressed in Annie Leonard's Story of Stuff, the person who consumes a heavy amount of merchandise every year made in China, energized by coal. Western lifestylers include, obviously, part of these Western lifestylers are also Western reformers, right? The environmentally concerned we, often educators or officials or members of environmental NGOs, and this we tries to get the other lifestyle we's to buy less stuff, to use public transportation, to take the train, and maybe even bike to the train. Sometimes we even model that behavior, although I'm often caught sitting on a panel with a plastic bottle of water in front of me, or flying to Europe to give a talk. As IPCC Chair Rajendra Pachauri put it when accepting the Nobel Prize for the IPCC, we should make sure there is a huge difference between the cost of flying and taking the train, and he recommends doing it by raising the cost of these activities through taxation. I will talk a little bit later about why this option tends to not be utilized, at least in our conversation at lunch. People are talking about how taxation has been a very useful method in Europe, but has not really been used as much quite in the United States. Instead, what we tend to do in the US, particularly in classrooms, is we get the Western lifestyle younger we's who are in our classrooms to calculate their carbon footprint. To maybe convince them not to fly to Berlin for the latest Euro Party event, or to think about the environmental effects of eating hamburger. Students often tell me that they didn't know about their effect on the environment before my class, and that they will try to do better in the future in order to live more lightly. Whether they actually lower their carbon footprint or just raise their guilt, I don't know. But there's another question. What do we do about the emergence of the Western lifestyle we in China, India, and other places? I should also tell you that these other Western lifestylers, I find that they are also in my classes. And we have simulated climate change negotiations that we do in my sustainability classes. And we don't have to simulate the roles of foreign nationals because those foreign nationals are there. And I can tell you that their actions in the simulations show that they are not ready to abandon their hard-won status as fellow Westerners, at least when it comes to lifestyle. They want their share of what India's environmental minister, Prakash Javadekar, calls their carbon space. The problem is the industrialized countries have already occupied much of that space and continue to. My forthcoming book, Dangerous Digestion, follows the emergence of this Western lifestyle which was part and parcel of the emergence of Western Enlightenment culture. The center of the conversation about Western lifestyles has been, and with some major exceptions continues to be, the United States of America. In fact, global epidemiologists tracking the emergence of American diet-related diseases across the globe refer to Western lifestyle eating as the standard American diet, or SAD. Global nutritionists see this diet and its diseases emerging in parallel with economic development in rapidly industrializing countries, along with other high-carbon lifestyle changes. In my attempt to understand the emergence of the Western lifestyler, I started with the American founders and followed the attempt to control the Western lifestyle from the beginning of the American system to today. What I found was that for more than a century, concerned reformers have tried, unsuccessfully, to get American citizens to change their lifestyle, in particular their eating habits. What can the history of these efforts tell us about moving people towards more sustainable lifestyles? Smoke and Mirrors is an edited volume with chapters from environmental historians and political sociologists narrating the politics of conventional air pollution. Looking back on these pages, I can confirm that there is no mention of global warming or climate change in that book, and only one fleeting mention of greenhouse gases. However, times have to some extent come full circle. The fight to reduce conventional air pollutants, nitrogen oxides, VOCs, sulfur, has become strongly melded with the larger fight to reduce carbon emissions. This is what I've learned from air pollution policy advisors like Michael Oppenheimer of the IPCC and World Bank economist Carter Brandon, who worked on China's air pollution plan. They state that the newly industrialized countries are being pressured by their own domestic populations to deal with the immediate effects of conventional air pollution, and the global hope is that these countries will agree to negotiate major reductions in carbon as a byproduct of these local concerns with conventional air pollution, because the transformation of their energy generation sectors to reduce conventional pollutants could also control carbon as a byproduct. A switch from a coal plant to a renewable technology means no need to figure out how to sequester carbon, and a switch to natural gas also means a reduction in carbon, although with its own methane trade-offs. A number of policymakers hope that this will be a win-win situation for both coral reefs and local lungs. However, I would argue that this transition will include the kind of complex political decision-making that, at least in the United States, we have avoided so far, large-scale changes in individual behavior. If, as some China scholars argue, Chinese politics is one in which citizens have exchanged freedom for the sake of Western amenities, Chinese officials are bound to provide convenience, comfort, and automobility, as well as animal protein and other aspects of the Western lifestyle in order to maintain power. This is true in democracies as well. Those of us who have been involved in attempts to change Western lifestyles know that public inconvenience works against elected officials. When I was a policy analyst, before I went back into academia, I was a policy analyst for the state of New York during the time of the implementation of the Clean Air Act of 1990. And the governor at that time, Mario Cuomo, father of the current governor, attempted to implement a very strict emissions inspection and monitoring system that would involve some inconvenience to drivers and voters, citizens. And many argue that this was one factor to his being voted out of office. Observing these conundrums, social scientists tell us that we have entered an era of increasing complexity, a risk society that must deal with a plethora of technologies, behaviors, institutions, networks, and structures. From the longue durée perspective, clean diet and clean air histories start to look more familiar, more similar. In the history of clean air, things got worse before they got better. Economic interests fought what they saw as unnecessary investment, although, as Peter Brimblecombe and Stephen Mosley describe in Smoke and Mirrors, when convinced that new devices would in fact save money, industrial managers were willing to implement these solutions. But not all solutions were win-win, and not everyone agreed that cleaning air was worth the trade-offs. Here's the cover of Stephen Mosley's book, and what he talks about there is how working-class people actually resisted the reforms of coal burning because it would eliminate the cheery, bright, coal-burning fireplaces in their homes, even though these fireplaces were a major contributor to the deadly smog pollution, which, ironically, made their lives cheerless except through their fireplaces. In addition, for the working class, a smokestack without smoke meant no work, something more important to them than clean air. Lung disease kills you, but not as fast as starvation. Smoke meant livelihood and comfort. And even when sustainable behaviors save individuals money, they sometimes will refuse to change. An official involved in a city mandated to retrofit buildings to make them less energy intensive and therefore cheaper to eat recently quipped to me, "Sometimes people refuse to save money." In other words, the global struggle between livelihood, comfort, lifestyle, and the environment in the current global climate change negotiations is long-standing and consistent. Some of the authors argue in Smoke and Mirrors that the rise of the middle class was both a cause of more emissions, but also necessary to give rise to the kind of constituency that would be willing to trade wealth for health. But if a particular emission-creating technology is at the center of Western lifestyle, suburbs, supermarkets, driving one's kids to lessons and soccer games, as any pollution control official can tell you, reducing miles driven is a hard nut to crack, and it is so embedded in who we, the Western lifestylers, are. Diet becomes an interesting case to study this larger issue. Attempts to change individual behavior have been at the crux of dietary advice for the last 200 years. Issues of obesity and diet parallel issues of rapid industrializing countries in their tensions over the right to comfort, pleasure, and freedom. What the history of dietary advice shows is that the issues of behavioral change are intrinsically linked to ideas about moral status and what I call the politics of purity. In Dangerous Digestion, I show how purity politics emerged from a particular answer to the problems of the emerging Enlightenment democracies of the 18th century, namely, how do you govern a free people and still maintain an orderly society? How do you avoid, in a society without an authoritarian ruler, the chaos of unruly mobs? This is something the American founders grappled with and answered in 3 different ways. And I have to go back to that one because, whoops. All right, here we go. Hamilton argued that we had to get institutions right to control intrinsically selfish behavior. Jefferson argued that property ownership would give citizens, at least white men, buy-in to the civil order. But the third answer to the question of order in a free society was formulated by a lesser-known American founder, Benjamin Rush. Rush argued that a free society was only possible with institutions that inculcate moral control, civic virtue, into a democracy's free citizenry. If democracy was to be an orderly free choice, it had to be reined in by training citizens in individual self-control. This is often referred to as the civic republican idea of democratic order. It may not surprise medical members of this audience to hear that Rush was a physician. In fact, one of the most best-known physicians of his day. He was known in particular for his theory of bloodletting as a cure for just about any disease. In my book, I argue that the civic republican idea of freedom as choice plus self-control was the seed of what became the politics of purity. Purity involves putting up a stronger border between the inside and outside and keeping the contagion out. It is a politics of exclusion that requires splitting the world into the controlled, the pure, and the uncontrolled, the impure, and then putting a boundary between the two. The pure then becomes the us and the impure the them, or the other. And social behavior change involves declaring what a pure lifestyle is and then shaming others into following that lifestyle. Eating exemplifies this activity. We are what we eat, what we allow to cross the borders between the inside and the outside, what we let into our bodies. In a world split between pure and impure, changed behavior is done through exhorting and shaming the impure to gain self-control. Education has been the major strategy to enlighten and convince others to change their behavior to become more orderly and pure. I see this in my students nowadays, particularly the environmental studies students, who are the students who tend to be in my classes, who want to change the world by educating people to know what they know, by making them more aware, by changing consciousness, by changing behavior, purifying others towards stewardship. I also see this in global figures like David Suzuki taking this approach, working towards a change of consciousness that will purify behavior. But yet increasingly it has become clear that the idea of purity is a conundrum. Clean eating, I have argued, is caught in a treadmill where cleanliness is an unachievable idea, leading to obsession with colonics and eating practices that equate personal health with increasingly restrictive eating habits. Clean eating is a conundrum because purity is an impossible dream. There is no such thing as pure eating or perfect food. And to seek this dream leads one to a treadmill of increasing rounds of purification in search of a perfect virtue. Conversely, clean eating is a practice that seems to catch a small number of people in this continual treadmill. Pure air is less of a conundrum. We all want to breathe clean air. We want a strong barrier against pollution, contamination, and other things we do not want to breathe into our bodies. Our bodies do better in a world where the air is pure. The early histories covering places like Manchester, England, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and smoke and mirrors are mostly about the progress Western industrialized cities have made to make their air cleaner and purer. By putting a strong barrier, scrubbers, catalytic converters, and other air cleaning devices between our lungs and the world, we have made significant progress in human health, although in some cases moving pollution from one sink to another. In other words, purity sometimes works. Putting strong barriers between people and pollution represents most of the progress we have made so far in terms of public health. In Smoke and Mirrors, the story of success in controlling smoke focuses on technology forcing roles that targeted large-scale industrial plants and automobile technology. These problems were tractable through national legislation and the development of regulatory and enforcement capacities through the tools of the modern state. This history of the rise of state capacity is one that shows that, that regulation and enforcement has given us safer food, cleaner water, and hospitals that were more likely to cure a person than kill them. It also, through systems of sanitation, gave us cities where children could grow up and thrive, places where those growing up in cities without sanitation can only dream about if they live to dream. My first book was about the rise of clean milk, and here's an example of how sanitation was very important to the history of providing milk to cities. Right. In the more industrialized nations, changing large-scale behaviors remains a conundrum in both dietary and air pollution policy. I'm going to go back to this quote here. All right. As Rajan states at the outset of his Smoke and Mirrors chapter on automobility, when a democratically elected polity is confronted with a severe environmental problem that is caused by normal and otherwise sanctioned behavior of nearly everyone in its constituency, it generally takes two distinct regulatory routes. One is to identify a small number of agents as the primary perpetuators, and in the air pollution that was the large-scale coal-burning plants. And what Dr. Rajan is talking about here is what do we do about automobiles? Or ensure that everyone pays a small but relatively obtrusive premium, like a tax, but it tends never to choose the more responsible third option, devising regulation to influence large-scale changes in behavior. That would be, he states, political suicide. Now, Smoke and Mirrors was published in 2004. Now, since then, the need to influence large-scale changes in behavior has become even more essential. As The Guardian reports, more than 70% of people in middle and high-income countries think that overconsumption is a major contributor to our environmental problems. But would those people vote for a government that regulated how much and what they could buy? Would they even be willing to vote for a government that insisted they paid 5 cents tax if they needed a plastic bag, or banned plastic bags altogether? Would they, and this is the most important question, be willing to pay higher taxes on gasoline, a lethal change that would significantly drop total miles driven? All of these changes would significantly help the environment. For example, in Washington, D.C., a recently imposed 5-cent tax on plastic bags. After that tax was imposed, the number of bags found in the Potomac River has been greatly reduced. Yet the 5-cent tax remains controversial. on plastic bags and has been implemented only on a piecemeal basis in a few municipalities. My students argue that the reason people don't make these personal changes or be willing to accept these kinds of taxes is because they don't care. Caring has become the proxy for purity politics. The world is divided between we who care, the 39% of people who own reusable bags who forget them less than 40% of the time and use them more than 141 times necessary to make them the carbon equivalent to a plastic bag. Those who drive high miles per gallon cars and don't drive more because of it, and those who avoid red meat. These reformed Western lifestylers see themselves as distinct from those other people who drive SUVs crammed with steak-filled plastic bags. The history of dietary advice is full of reformed Western lifestylers who are also Western reformers, starting with Benjamin Rush, who in later life wrote letters to John Adams complaining that the country was going to the moral dogs. He argued that people did not take their citizenship seriously, caring only about making money for luxury and comfort. Later abolitionists like Bronson Alcott believed that inculcating self-controlled behavior, like abjuring meat, would be the end of slavery. In the progressive era, these are all eras that I talk about in Dangerous Digestion, newly minted professional nutritionists advised workers to eat less meat rather than ask for higher wages. And much of this century, nutritionists have tried to get people to eat differently for the sake of their own health. What I found in my history of American dietary advice was that from Revolutionary Rush to contemporary Jamie Oliver, who has tried to change children's eating habits by cooking in public schools, citizens have mostly ignored dietary advice, refusing to participate in the heightening of consciousness, that awakening that reformers attempt to bring to the masses. The children Oliver cooks for prefer pizzas and tacos defrosted for them by the lunch ladies. The delicious food Oliver cooks for them ends up in the trash. If we can't get people to change their behavior for the sake of their own health, how will we get them to change behavior for a much more abstract goal like air pollution or greenhouse gases? Since 2004, has there been any progress discovering another option besides political suicide or ineffective exhortation? There's another option that is emerging from a number of different contexts. Geographers call it multi-level sustainable governance. Hippies tend to call it permaculture. Planners call it smart cities. But the more general word seems to be, and the one that I tend to use, is sustainable design. Designers, planners, geographers, engineers, and let's not forget the hippies, have been using their design skills not to change human behavior by changing consciousness or lifestyle, but by making sustainable lifestyle possible by changing the way people are able to live. So when I talk about sustainable design to my students, I usually start with bike share systems. Hippies started bike share systems by making free bikes available in places like Amsterdam, where they painted them white and left them around the city. The problem, of course, was that the bikes disappeared. More recently, bike share systems have been popping up. Going back to here. Here we go. Have been popping up in major cities, but the early attempts by a small number of people, what geographer Frank Giels calls a social niche, all right? This is a Giels. I'm a big fan of Frank Giels. What the geographer Frank Giels calls a social niche allowed for design iteration, observing and changing strategies that sometimes are more likely to work. Okay. As a result, these newer systems are organized very differently than the early white bike project. Instead, they are a complex system organized at many networks and scales. Most require both a social movement around biking, a municipality or a set of municipalities in support of both bike lane development and money support, since none of these systems have yet become self-sustaining, right? Private enterprises are also often involved in the payment, bike technology, maintenance systems. And sometimes these are social enterprises, sometimes profit only, sometimes private company sponsorship like City Bike in New York City. State-level commitments are necessary for funding these systems, often to relieve shortfalls or to build bike lanes. Finally, National Clean Air Act or transportation funds allocated to public transport are necessary to build or maintain these systems, although it is necessary for all of these levels to exist as well. I am not saying that bike share systems will save us from the vagaries of other forms of environmental pollution. In fact, there are some real problems with bike share systems, which I won't get into here. But I am saying that they point to processes. It's the processes that bike share systems represent that give us an idea of how to implement large-scale behavior change without the problems we see in my history of dietary advice. This kind of system does depend on some people having a vision of a different way of organizing behavior. But those people do not just shame people into riding their bikes more. Instead, they organize the world so that biking fits into people's lives. While there is some public resistance, especially to using up car lanes for bike lanes, the projects have actually built up a strong support network. If any of these bike services go under, which some are likely to do in the next few years, I suspect the public outcry will be strong to support them. So I just want to give you some general criteria or the elements of these kinds of sustainable design transformation governance processes. Okay. First of all, these processes are reflexive. The problems in these systems are up for public civic discussion. They are never presented as the perfect solution. Of course, current events that attempt to reduce the role of civil society also reduce the possibility of these forms of governance to occur. That is, that civil society, an active and vibrant civil society, is necessary for the kind of discourse necessary to put together these kinds of transformative systems. They are iterative. That is, public discussion of system problems leads to trying out different systems, to redesign, continually thinking about redesign. They are multi-level. They take place in a joined-up system of institutions and networks that go from local, municipal, state, national, and hopefully global. They are networked. That is, they go beyond scale and join up these different scales through cross-scale institutional structures and also social movements that are cross-scale. They are inclusive. That is, they work best when they work for everyone and are open to analysis by critical sustainability scholars, of which I am one, who question the inclusiveness of current policies of sustainability and resilience, including the bike share systems themselves that have been critiqued as being only used by people at higher income people. And finally, they are imperfect. They are never presented as the ideal solution or the pure. They are never used in a way for one group of people to declare a superior social status over other groups. So I want to leave you with one question. Where are the global institutions, the part of the macro, in that macro landscape there in the Giels diagram, in this design? How can they encourage the emergence of these kinds of global governance systems that I've defined here? For example, is the UN program, the RED program, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, designed to have these elements? Would adding more of these elements make the RED program more successful? Coming to Geneva, a center of global governance, seems like the right place to ask these kinds of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. So our second presentation will be made by Dr. Carlos Dora. Carlos is a health policy expert with WHO's leading work on health impacts of sector policies, energy, transport, housing, extractive industry, etc., involving health impact assessment and systems to manage health risks and benefits. He manages WHO units in charge of providing guidance, health risks, air pollution, indoors and outdoors, radiation, occupation, as well as monitoring, evaluation, and tracking related policies and health impacts. Dr. Dora leads WHO work on health in a green economy, analyzing health co-benefits from climate change mitigation policies, and is developing WHO's work on health indicators for post-2015 SDGs. He is engaged in health co-benefits of sustainable energy initiatives, including SE4 all, JCC and CCAC. They work at the London School and European Public General. He worked in US and policy committees. His MS and from the London School of sector policy, impact assessment, and communication.
Thank you. And give a very entertaining break. I think it's very useful to particularly something about where including exposed diseases to have pushing to us on the table. And I think we're probably focused on with the public health community, and one we continue to do this stable design and we agree with you that there's a chance that we have to be. But I'll try to cover some of the activities that have been in that direction and what we're at the moment trying to develop. So the main reason, and I think one important is that recently, that is over the last 10 maybe years, there's evidence on evolution impact on health that didn't exist before. We used to think it was just a spiritual system. Now we know this is a vascular disease that's creating heart disease, strokes. You know, there's associations with dementia, with diabetes. So, although the big ticket items are heart disease and stroke, I think it's important that we realize that this is all new evidence, which is in addition to the respiratory disease. The lung on the right is tobacco, the smoker. The one on the left is who's been breathing indoor air pollution, which is a more concentrated form of air pollution. Macroscopically, they look in microscopic. I'll show you a few. A few later, they also have similarity. So we're thinking of an exposure that is going to have a diluted tobacco smoke. That's what people are breathing pollution. But the importance is that people in the world die of strokes, heart disease, and non-communicable diseases. And this is also for developing countries. And this is costing the health sector a lot of money, and the families and people a lot of resources. And so far, the way we're formulating this is articulating the response in WHO and in the world with the UN resolution is through those 4 risk factors: tobacco control, physical inactivity, diet, including low-fat diet, and excess use of alcohol. So one of the jobs of we, the public health community, is to really include air pollution because its level of impact is similar to those other risk factors. To include that air pollution, at least from the practical point of view. It also brings a number of other partners on that. So we do a science review as we would, because we draw on science, we find out that there's all this new evidence, and we should really be measuring much more the impacts of air pollution on heart disease. This review includes a systematic analysis of studies, analysis, for example, these are mortality trends in relation to air pollution. You see, it's quite low levels of air pollution at the bottom. And if you increase air pollution, even at those very low levels, which are in American cities, you know, or in some developed countries, you still see an important impact of air pollution. The more polluted the air, the worse it is. This is carotid arteries, the artery that takes blood to your brain. And how is it that the people who live in more air polluted places, and you see the levels are quite low, much lower than you have in developing countries. You have this damage in the vascular system, which is associated then with strokes and with heart disease, etc. I won't bore you with this. This is other air pollutants. Those previous ones were particles. This is ozone. This is, again, ozone and the various diseases. It's a bit difficult today, but it includes mostly cardiovascular, and showing that those diseases are very affected by ozone as well. Diesel is a particular large source of particles, which is the main cause, the main what's having studied demonstrated to have a link to health, and is also a carcinogen. And you've all heard about diesel recently and the fact that people have been fidgeting around the measures to clean the air from diesel. But in general, it's important that we understand that some of those there's a fuel is so directly linked to ill health. This is another of those vascular. This is an experiment. People who breathe clean air and then a diesel-contaminated air and then clean air, you'll see an increase in the heart rate, which is in the top. You'll see alterations in the electrocardiogram, which is another demo. It's just a few demonstrations because, and I'm bringing them here because normally there's a lack of awareness of that, even within the medical and the public health community, that this is a vascular disease. So what we do with that understanding from science and from the measures of people who are exposed to air pollution is to do burden of disease. That's the way we relate our information. And how much does that risk factor add to the existing disease rates in your country or in your city? We also benefit recently from an increased access to information on levels of air pollution. This is from satellite remote sensing. We now bring together this. We have a global platform on air quality and health in WHO. We bring everybody who has data on air pollution in the world together to try to get good quality data. That's the main purpose of the platform. And these people come. These are the NASA's, the JAXA's, the people who have satellites. We mix that and we integrate that with information from ground level monitors. And these are the cities. This is a WHO database which has levels of air pollution in cities, which are measured by the cities, not by ourselves. But we bring them together and we get assess the quality, etc. So those are the cities. They used to be 1,600. Now, for the next update, we'll have almost 2,000 cities, which are contributing to this global database. Many of the new cities are in Asia, in China, in Africa. Still, we have a big gap. There's parts of the world which we have gaps. I won't show you this. This is just some of the validation studies. But basically, that's what we've been packing and using some basic statistics to synthesize that information that are used to calculate the levels of burden of disease. And that's the results. 7 million deaths a year. Now, you could say that's equivalent to the largest risk factors that we have today. This is putting together indoor air pollution and outdoor air pollution. Half of those 7 million roughly are due to indoor and to outdoor air pollution. And most of it, as you see, is happening in Asia. You see China and India well represented. I think the whole spectrum of the African burden of disease is still a bit of an underestimate because lack of exposure assessment. So this is from outdoor air, 4 million is from indoor air, and that by itself is a huge issue because there's very few solutions for this problem. So potentially we could have an enormous benefit for public health globally if we just deal with this. And this is women who are staying at home, is children, is the main cause of death, is main risk factor for pneumonia disease. I mean, you may think that with vaccines we'll do a lot for pneumonia prevention. You do, but you would be doing more if you're eliminating indoor air in the homes of the poor. Those numbers were 2014. This decision from the Ministers of Health of the world was 2015, May this year, and they have made to say, well, this is a very important burden. We have to be doing something about it as Ministers of Health, even if we know that the pollution comes from elsewhere. I mean, a bit comes from the health sector, but most of it comes from outside the health sector. But you know, what's the role that we then have to pay? And they identified that our role, or the role that they want to be seen, is that to build the strength and capacity of the health authorities to play game. Through monitoring systems, to assessing what policies are better for health and for air pollution, to doing comparisons that focus on the role of the health sector. And how does it link with the Sustainable Development Goals, and how do we put this in the development agenda? So traditionally, or the core functions of WHO, and I'll just review, in relation to our pollution, they were this. air quality guidelines. And that's been a great product used all over the world. This is the world's reference. And we had focused in the past primarily on that, air quality guidelines, and some on the indoor air pollution. Now, the challenge now is to, and we're starting to respond to that, is how do we bring that kind of scientific rigor, because everybody believes in these guidelines because of the procedures that we have here. We not only bring any science together, we have a lot of transparency, accountability, quality criteria that go into that. But there's other questions, like, for example, what transportation systems that we need that would reduce air pollution, but what are the transportation that would not only reduce air pollution, but also do other things like reduce injuries or reduce noise? I mean, you're not interested necessarily only in air pollution. I mean, that's your splitting up unnecessarily a response, and the public health should be thinking of abroad. So these are science reviews of what are the public transports, what are the transport systems that work for health, which include a mixture of safe walking and cycling and public transport. We can do analysis and we do synthesize research. This is air pollution-related transport, the benefits that can be expected in European cities by reducing or eliminating that source of pollution. So increasingly we do health impact assessments, which goes along with environment and social impact assessments of the policy, so we can identify that. We have some assessments of cost-benefit analysis. And these are examples of the kinds of tools that we have in-house already that we can make more use of. The global databases that we host here for urban air pollution, for indoor air pollution, for household energy sources. And also we can guide research. We haven't been doing that in the frame of air pollution, but that would be one of the things that we think should be in the request by the member states. The research that responds to the key questions, what are the knowledge gaps that we need to respond to. And communication, although we don't want only to nudge and get people to do what we want, but we think there's a lot of lack of awareness of what are the co-benefits of these different policy options. You know, in the public space, we don't have yet from the transportation systems, from agriculture, for example, they produce a lot of methane that leads to particles, or even the home and buildings heating and cooling. New York City learned that more than half its pollution was from the way the fuel they use to heat and cool buildings. So the specificity, those kinds of tools we have now to bring to play into the kinds of response to air pollution that can also produce public health. We've been working with including that in the SDGs, also as requested by the industry. One indicator for the SDG on cities, which is urban air pollution, where we have the local database. There is one on access to clean energy fuels and technology in the home, as defined by WHO guidelines. And we have new guidelines which says exactly which fuels are bad for health and which are good and how much, and how clean a cook stove have to be, for example, which are again new. They're from 2014, but they are potentially game changers. Because just to give you an example here, the world has invested over 50 years in poorly improved cook stoves, more or less improved, clay, basic, local. We found out in the science reviews that they don't work. You know, they may be a good idea from the point of view that is a bit of wishful thinking. It'd be very nice if they worked, if they were cheap and local, built locally. So they don't work. So the first step that we are providing with this guidance is exactly so, well, that doesn't work. Let's see what works. We know the other thing that doesn't work is kerosene. Bad, disaster. People don't know that kerosene is bad for health. It's used even in rich countries like Japan for home heating, or Saudi Arabia. So there's this lack of, is not only nudging, is informing about where are the risks, and the risks that people didn't realize that they were risks. On the other hand, ethanol, liquid gas, those are clean fuels. Electricity is very clean and can be very cheap in certain locations. So there are. So our role is providing that. This is the guidance that I'm referring to. So that's one key role for the health sector that only the health sector can produce, because synthesize the evidence in an issue which is very contentious politically. Issue has many interests, economic interests, and we have to have the independence and the capacity to produce strong recommendations which are based in very solid. And and back it up. So because with that, we're sort of being engaging with many of the people who have been investing in so-called improved cook stoves and saying, well, where are the options where you should be going to get the results well. And we also have an indicator on health, which is to do with pollution, where air pollution is. And actually, it's going to be the burden of disease, the country's request. So we will have an entry point in the sustainable development goals, which is correct, because this is linked to the models of development and how health is directly linked to models of development. So I think that's one other way. And increasingly, we will have to be looking on the sources, because the sources will differ. In the US, agriculture, or in Europe as well, methane is very important. In other places, in most places of the world, the households and the buildings, heating and cooling is possibly the first cause. But there are other causes. There's transportation that you've mentioned. There's industry, although industry tends to be, because they're more controlled, more easily controlled. Today, in the modern world, they tend to be cleaner and not such a big. So this is another source of data that's being used. Is we use air transport models. These are chemical models that how pollutants are produced, how they react in the air, where they travel to. And we can produce these kinds of maps that show different sources of pollution, where they are, and that we can overlay with burden of disease. Again, it's not only this, this is the same for cities. And we can gradually also build, we're doing housing and health guidelines in WHO, which talk a lot about the housing and the building's energy efficiency, and give also very clear criteria for what's good and for what's not. There's follow-up studies of this. If you improve the quality of the energy efficiency in the home, you have less disease, you have less use of health services. There's follow-up studies. There's good quality evidence. In New Zealand, primarily, has been a leader on this. And that's not necessarily used by, so I think our role is, this is slum dwellings in South Africa being, using solar panels to improve to provide access to hot water, which seems to be a simple thing, but it does facilitate hygiene and has a number of implications. And the other is to understand that indoor air pollution also causes outdoor air pollution, as you can see there. Not only in, I'm not sure if this is Nepal or this is Guatemala, but many places in the world, but it's also in the Chamonix Valley just down the road, where the Sikh people, because of their fire, and is also in Montana, in the US, it's a beautiful valley in the south of Chile. So there's also rich areas, because they don't realize that they are creating outdoor air pollution through indoor air. These are the energy solutions for the home. The other entry point that we are definitely focusing in is on the interfaces with climate change that you were just raising, and the fact that a same policy, and I'm giving an example of transportation here on the left, a same policy will produce air pollutants, will produce short-lived climate pollutants like black carbon, will produce also long-lived climate pollutants like CO2, but will also produce a number of other, or reduce the number of other risks to health, for industries, for physical activity, for noise. So to have that full picture is something that uniquely the health sector can bring, because we have this broad view of the whole individual and the range of risk factors which affect health. So that's something which I find quite unique, to provide that broad picture from any form of public policy. Finally, we're focusing on cities, because it's just the obvious, right? I mean, people are moving to cities. This is where interfaces with air pollution are. And this is where there's also more of a critical mass and possibilities of people taking action, like on the bicycle or other examples, to improve the design and local governance of the source of this risk to health. So it's not only individual behavior, which is important. I mean, the political, if you're eating less red meat because of fat, and your arteries, also because of climate, that's probably a good idea. In some places of the world, it might not be, where people have very little access to nutritious foods, and where meat would be enough. So it depends on where you are. So if you're talking average, country middle class person, yeah, to reduce meat consumption. That's not by any means a panacea. And I think that the beauty of cities work that we're doing is exactly to look at the public policies, including in terms of urban agriculture, but to look at the public policies in that city and to identify what are the options for reducing pollution and improving health in that specific cities, where are the opportunities and gaps. And for the health sector, then to build on that is to help identify where are the most co-benefits. What is the cost of the city not investing in pollution prevention? What is the cost to individuals? What is the cost to the health system, to health care, to the planning of? So localize the information and make use of local information, and where are the risks, potential solutions, where are the benefits. So I think that role, because of the role of advisor on public health that the health system has, is very important. It will also have a role for the healthcare provider, the nurse, doctor, who's saying, well, if you have a heart disease, don't be exposed to air pollution. Avoid your, unimproved cook stove. Or there will be some individual advice, which is also possible, but most of this is sort of getting the package for the city and putting that in the discussion. We believe the health sector talks a lot about health in our policies. We haven't yet necessarily done all the implementation of that, and this is exactly what we're talking about. This is operationalizing health in our policies, going there and looking at urban design, transportation, food and access in the city, and mapping out and informing the public community. So this is the new we on our jargon. Who we, public health, what are the skills that we need to have to provide to clean the air and to reduce the burden of disease from that. So that's my comment of where we are in our reflection. Of course, there's a lot of the practice and learning by doing and learning from experience is essential. But pleased to be able to exchange with you. Thank you.
Okay, so we've had two very good presentations, and we'll now open it up for discussion both here and anyone who's listening by the internet. If they want to ask a question, they're welcome as well.
Yeah. Can I just start by saying I thank you for these comments, Dr. Carlo. I want to just say ignorance is not bliss. I believe that information is very important and particularly new information like this is also very important. But the challenge then is to go from this new global knowledge to then how do you then work with cities, which are all contextual and different and so on. So that's what I'm seeing as the challenge that you're facing.
Absolutely. That's certainly.
Yes, please go.
Hi, thank you.
Can you introduce yourself as well?
I'm Barbara Zulte. I'm working with CCU, Country Cooperation and UN Collaboration. So I've been thinking a lot, again, you touched upon a lot of very important points. I think maybe I'll go to Carlos, because I think, Carlos, you were the ones that talked a lot about the possibilities for entry points, and I totally agree with you on a lot of the challenges, but also the opportunities. And everybody recognizes now the SDGs are a huge opportunity for the health sector. And yes, the health sector has a great ability to really try to pull the different components together. So maybe I'd like to find out a little bit more about what are some of the tangible pieces that are going to be put in place as far as I mean, for example, if we ask even in-house, WHO, a lot of how the ministries of health, for example, work is based on how WHO also works, how we're divided and how we divide our own work up. So, for example, are there discussions right now going on with even cross-cluster with, the NCD cluster about working as far as how to have joint, let's say, projects going forward, because everybody's in their vertical, program going into ministries of health, you should do this, you should do that, but just some ideas on what's happening with that. And then the second part is also who's going to be taking this forward as far as capacity building for the Ministry of Health to have them be able to work more across sectors, to work with the Ministry of Transport, to work with Ministry of Environment, etc., because that's been recognized as a really important way of going forward. So maybe if you could maybe talk if there's any tangible aspects going on, how first in-house and then working with the different ministries, we can take that forward.
Carlos, you want to go first? Yeah.
Well, thank you. Very good points, of course. We are, for the air pollution resolution, we're doing a roadmap for the response, and which is going to be adopted the next World Health Assembly, and which includes, the focus is exactly that. And how is it that, in a part of it, how does we construct work joint with NCDs and with child pneumonia? Child pneumonia has more, more progress has been done already. We're already part of the list, group of interventions, so there's more, a longer history. In the meantime, because this is May 2016, in the meantime, we're testing this model with cities that I was just describing, which is actually how do we train the health sector to respond to this kind of complex issues and not go into nudging mode and say, well, this is what you should be doing. How they can play game and understand what are the others. So there's we're going to do that in a few cities immediately. We feel it's a good pilot for the whole work in general. And I can tell you a bit more about that, because I think that the idea is to pilot, to learn the lessons of how the health sector get at speed. In parallel, we're doing advice for national level for household air pollution, for household energy. And this is in how easy that they can switch. For example, Indonesia has changed to changing incentives, in financial incentives. They moved from subsidizing kerosene to subsidizing liquid gas. Now, they save money, and that was their objective, but they're also producing a lot of good health. So there's some work on the indoor air. So those are the two streams that we're focusing on. But Maria has a point to add.
No, I think the question is so important, and you want to go a little bit beyond how the...
And even in your response, I'm wondering, who are you working with? Are you working with the Ministry of Environment? Are you working with other ministries, or is it just health again?
Oh, no. Of course, it is completely. But our understanding is, how do we change the we? I think you're right in the way it is. We have to also work in another way. And you do have the discourse of health in our policies. We have some work on that. But the operationalization of that has been much more timid. So this is very squarely on that space. How is it that the public health system in a city and the Ministry of Health can start interacting with the transportation, the energy, etc.? What are the tools that they need? What are the skills? And to experiment that on a handful of cities initially. Difficult cities, large cities, and we're talking Lagos, Cairo, it's not like any city. And to move, to learn a bit by doing with the Ministry of Health. But we think there's a big change which is required in this capacity building that we have to do.
An organization needs to rethink a little bit as well how we will be positioning ourselves on the next SDGs, and Carlos was describing the map and where we are interacting with other goals. For us as PHE, the ones working with other sectors, is so natural that we see it as a logic next step. How pass this culture across the house and making sure that other departments that maybe they have a different tradition on working with the ministries of health and less experience of working with other sectors, how we will organize ourselves on a corporate way to change that and make that switch that is so necessary. And it's the implementation of the health in all policies, and again, for us, it's so natural that it comes with the daily work. But in other departments and the NCDs will require a little change of culture. I think this discussion is already occurring in-house, but necessarily we need to be the ones pushing for it, because we cannot miss that part of the we. If WHO is not moving into that direction, you rightly said, some ministries of health will duplicate our model, and they might not see the need to change the way they work with other sectors and the way we use the city as the laboratory where public health will be now exploding. You know, 70% of the global population will be living in urban areas in 30 years from now. So we need to work with the mayors, and we need to work with other sectors, and we need to make sure that everybody in WHO understands that, everyone. And it might take a while through the SDGs, and with your collaboration and the kind of collaboration strategies we will make it.
Can I just add something to that? And just using, and I'm not, bike share systems will save the, it just is using it as a model. The origin of bike share systems really came from sort of grassroots social movements. And so when we talk, you know, and often at these sort of higher levels of governance, we talk about participation, but participation often becomes, oh, we got to get everybody around a table. Whereas these kinds of sustainable, transformational governance systems are a little bit more complex than simply that. It's you know, there are people who are working on the ground. How do you make these connections that are not just, well, we're going to have a hearing and have them talk, and then they'll go away and we'll go back.
Hello, Simon Hales. I'm an editor in the bulletin here in WHO. I'm just wondering about the balance, really, between what we need in terms of technological advance and more this kind of systems level change that you've described. So a question to both of you, really. Can we live sustainably with the technology we have now, or do we need to, of course, if the technology was better, that would help, but do we need technological advance, or do we primarily need more better politics?
Well, when I talk about iterative governance, the technology sector is certainly part of that. Once again, I'm using share bikes as an example. As the problems with share bikes happened, right? How do you get individuals to pay for them? How do you make sure they don't get stolen? So on and so forth. Those actually then caused a set of induced innovations, right? That, you know, when we used to talk about induced innovations in policy, we used to talk about government saying, well, you have to create new, fancier scrubbers, right? And, you know, we put in together laws, which are still very important, to say, okay, you have to use the best available control technology, and we're going to make it really hard to do that. And so you're going to have to innovate technology. In this case, it's, well, we can't actually have this system unless we have, you know, new forms of payment and new forms of new kinds of bike technologies and so on. And so they have, you know, a set of startup technology, social entrepreneurs who are trying to put together these new technologies, often going out of business, and in and out of business. And so it's a kind of technological change that has to happen, and that innovation is definitely going to be part of any of these systems.
I'll add to that there's a lot of good technologies and clean technologies that don't get used. Just, I mean, you take the household energy example. I mean, many cities have slums which are using solid fuel, burning biomass, etc. So it can be 20% of the ambient air pollution, it can be 25%. In urban areas in general, even in developing countries, there's access to electricity. There's very cheap induction stoves, which are also very effective. So people in India are using that, and that's the right thing to do in some circumstances where there's access to it. So I think it's a question of also facilitating what clean technology.
Can I just very briefly come back on that? I mean, I do agree, but I think the issue of inequality and the divide between rich and poor and the power relationships is something which is kind of, I mean, you did mention it and is part of the discussion, but I think it needs to be a bigger part.
I would say that inclusivity is going to become, because part of the problem with these new sustainable technologies tend to be that they're only being used by, you know, certain members of, you know, upper classes for the most part. And how do you come up with systems that are more inclusive and that's a real challenge.
I was thinking about the roadmap and the different cities that you mentioned, like Cairo and Lagos, and the health and health policy concept. Can you explain how that works? How does it start? If you want to work, for example, on air pollution in, let's say, Cairo, then who will be put forward, which government or institution, and how? Talking about inclusiveness, how will everybody will be incorporated? I just wonder where you start, because it's such a big problem, and yeah, cities are very difficult anyway, I guess, to manage. So maybe could you say a bit more about that, or is that not yet so far good?
I can say a lot about that. What we're thinking, and we're about to start yet with them. So I'm just coming from Cairo yesterday, and I think the idea is, how do we equip the health sector to have this broad understanding? What are the basic skills? What are the basic database? How do they start engaging with others? So it comes also from the experience from health and health policies, what the training package that people have done here. And so we draw on a variety of the kinds of knowledge that we just explained in terms of, and then you have to identify the sources, to identify the stakeholders, and what the policy options. So there's a set of, probably will require a bit more, a longer conversation, which we're happy to have. We had already within the department, but we could have with others. But I think that opens up an opportunity to also learn about we're drawing from all the experience that we have from working with other sectors, in housing, in transport, in energy, in things like that, with health impact assessment, with cost benefits. So we're drawing the tools that we have, creating a package, and then piloting with the cities. It's going to be with Ministry of Health, Ministry of Environment, obviously, but also with people from other sectors. So I think it probably requires a longer conversation. But the transformation of the we is central to that. So how do we give, one of the work is with the World Bank. What is the package? The World Bank wants to lend money for the health sector to strengthen the capacity of the health sector or health in our policies. What is it that they would be funding? To have a model that can be plugged in as part of the strengthening of health system is not something which we don't know where does it fit. To really characterize what are the skills, the capacity, the tools, and the ways of working, etc. So to build that, the ambition, which is a large ambition, I admit, is to create that model in the cities or with the cities too. And I think equity is essential. I mean, we're focusing on poor cities, people. There's lots of poor people. So how do we bring health equity with as part of that equation is central to the objective of the project.
I just want to add that one of the ways in which people are becoming more inclusive in terms of city design is, and this is part of sort of the new urbanism movement, is this idea of building cities to the human scale. And when those kinds of redesign are done right, they tend to build for, because of course what we see in a lot of inequality in a lot of these developing cities is that the people, the higher income people are in cars and the lower income people are walking, often breathing in the result of the people who are driving. And so when you think about sort of these new urbanist systems that encourage less driving, that may also, and this is the work of Jan Gale, I think, is one of the new urbanists who've been talking about this idea of developing these human scale cities, is that once you have people walking together, you have less inequality because everybody's together in the same place, in public places, so that if you have a city that's all about driving, the public places go away because nobody wants to walk anymore. And therefore you create this split between classes because because of the split between transportation. If you redesign cities around people being able to be together in public spaces, one, you've created civil society, which enables discourse, which enables critique, which then enables iteration. You can't really iterate. You can't really rework systems and say, hey, this is unequal. Let's make something more equal here if there's no place to actually say that. And so creating these different kinds of systems are these what are called, and then we have these smart cities that people are trying to put together, which have a lot of critics who are saying, oh, this is just gentrification. But then that kind of iteration then of how do we make these more equal, but that one thing that seems to make cities more equal is to get them out of cars.
City level and the Ministry of Health level, perhaps to bring it down a little bit more to the practical, that traditionally there was a water and sanitation manager in the health ministry, and traditionally there's been food safety managers in health ministries. So I think that that kind of skill base, it has to be acknowledged that air pollution management will be part of the health ministry role, and then there can be evaluation at city level. What's the burden? Of course, on the other side, you need the monitoring systems from at least the Environment Ministry or someone to do it. But traditionally, it doesn't seem to me that the health ministry has been acknowledged or empowered to have those, to put budget aside to have those skills. And perhaps one of the first places we can start to build that is in schools of public health, that the more investment is made in these skill bases and grants to young researchers, perhaps even collaborations as part of what we're doing with schools of public health, with air quality people that are doing statistical evaluation of air quality, then that gives a basis in a city for also talking to the other sectors. So that's just a practical point to say, how do we build up that skill base in ministries that are really strapped for budget?
So there's a question from the web. My name is Tunga. I'm from Mongolia, and our capital city has one of the worst air pollutions in the world. I just want to know what the speakers would advise about community engagement and mobilization in reducing the burdens and impacts of air pollution on people. In our city, efforts have been made for a decade and more now to improve urban governance, housing, roads, but a whole generation's life is wasted as the situation worsens. I wonder if there are ways communities can support ministries of health and the health sector work. Certainly such an approach helped progress in many other areas, such as HIV and AIDS. Thanks.
Your air pollution problem is big, yes. It's all to do with burning coal in the GERs, which are, or a lot of it is to do with one source, which is coal burning for household heating. And I think that, I know that there's some attempts of improved technology to having more efficient stoves that burn better. There's been overall an estimated improvement on that, but still I agree with you, there's a very high level of air pollution, even with this improvement. So I think the solution would be perhaps with civil society and others in the health sector, looking at the I think electricity could be one of the solutions, because this is all in the same area, which is the valley around Ulaanbaatar. So I think there are solutions, and probably what civil society could do is to try to experiment or push for some more advanced technologies than improved coal cook stoves. That would be my opinion. We haven't discussed that with the Ministry of Health. We've discussed other things with the Ministry of Health, but they were very positive in working across sectors on the mining sector, for example. And they have some people in the WHO office, in the Ministry of Health, who understand very well this business of working with other sectors. So I would certainly see that as a possibility would be to reach out to some of those people and to experiment with some of the other solutions. I think induction stoves, for example, so we have to see what other possibilities are there. But in terms of clean fuels, perhaps. But I'm hopeful. I think that's a conversation that can be taking place because the government already understands some of these intersectoral issues.
When I work with students on, because I do project management, sort of teach project management, and I teach it from the sort of perspective of what came out of basically Silicon Valley, because there people would create these codes and they would create these applications, and then people wouldn't use them, right? So they would, what Silicon Valley started to do is they started to say, well, we have to start with users, and they call it user-centered design. And so when I start to work on a challenging project with students, the first thing I'd say is, well, the first thing you have to do is go and ask questions of the people who are being challenged. And so the first thing I would say is that it's really important to start with the people who are in this situation where they feel like they have to use these stoves and so on, and start with talking to people in this place. I wouldn't have any advice for anyone in any place before I had talked to the people who are actually there. And it's what I would rather, in this situation, what would be great is to learn more from you and from other people who are in your capital city and find out more about what the problem is before I could ever come up with a way of having better technology in these places.